Excuse me. I saw the rope and the GoPro camera attached to your backpack, and I couldn't help but overhear you asking your server if there were any abandoned buildings nearby. I don't mean to pry into your business, but if you got a minute, you ought to meet me in that corner at the end of the bar. The truth is, a lot of urban explorers have come through the city in the last couple of years. It only makes sense in a dying Rust Belt area like this one. We've got crumbling opera houses, flooded theaters, boarded up schools that haven't had students walking their hallways in over a century. Some are safer than others. But there's one place that you absolutely must not go. I'm talking about St. Catherine's Cathedral, over on the northeast side of town. It's a grand old church, but you won't find it in any register of historic places. There aren't any services on Sunday, or any other day for that matter. No light ever shines inside those barred, stained glass windows, and its thick double doors stay barred all year round. It's a cathedral without a priest, without a congregation, without even a name on the signpost out front. And I'm warning you now, you need to stay away from it. Every time I start to tell the story, I hesitate. It doesn't have a happy ending or any heroes. And besides, how could I ever convince some stranger that I, a washed-up 50-something busboy, used to be a famous artist? It doesn't help that I never signed my works with my real name. But in my defense, I never really knew it. Matthew Geller was just the name that the nuns at St. Catherine's Orphanage gave me. I have no record of anything that came before that. Not even a birth certificate. My first memories were just neatly made steel beds, hushed white hallways, and the black-clad figures who walked down them. Although I'm sure not all of the orphans who grew up at St. Catherine's would agree, I loved my life inside those walls. There was an order and sense of justice to the place that the world outside seemed to lack. The nuns I knew were stern but kind, and they encouraged my talent for drawing and sculpture. There didn't seem to be a single book published after the 1950s in all of the orphanage. So, I learned by imitating the masters. Bernini, Rodin, and of course, Michelangelo. I was penniless, but our Mother Superior's intervention allowed me to obtain a full scholarship to a well-known art school. There would be no dining hall there to serve me oatmeal in the morning and boiled vegetables at night. No hall monitor to turn the lights out at 9 o'clock. I was going to be completely on my own. My new dorm mates didn't make their beds each morning or even iron their clothes. They slept in late, played the noise they called music at an ear-splitting volume, and stank up the whole building with the funny-smelling stuff they smoked. They argued constantly about artists I'd never heard of, and the only thing they all seemed to agree on was how much they disliked my own style. It was too classical, they said, too bland and outdated and bourgeois. I didn't understand it. Weren't we here to learn from the great masters? Work hard and become the best creators that we could be? I tried to focus on my work. I tried to remind myself of all the sacrifices that Mother Superior had made so that I could have a chance to pursue my dreams. But the truth was that I envied my classmates. During those long hours in the studio, I daydreamed about what it would be like to sit on the quad with a couple friends, a guitar, and a hidden flask of whiskey. How would it feel, I wondered, to forget about all these deadlines and final projects just for a little while? Ironically, it was there, hunched over yet another not-quite-perfect clay model, that I made my first friend. "You're always here," a voice said behind me, making me jump. Yeah, I shrugged and tried to keep sculpting, but the red-headed girl's stare made it impossible. We had some classes together, but this was the first time I'd heard her speak. "So?" the girl went on, looking from my neatly combed hair to my polished shoes. "Are you, in a cult or something?" In the ensuing conversation, I discovered that her name was Marissa, and she was majoring in something called abstract metallurgy. Her nose ring, denim jacket, and chipped nail polish led me to assume that she was just as much of an edgy, hipster tryhard as the rest of them. But she turned out to be one of the most thoughtful, open-minded people I ever knew. She invited me to meet her for lunch later that day, and with my heart racing, I accepted. I was more than a little disappointed to find that Marissa wasn't alone at her table by the dining hall window. Alec, another classmate of ours, was there with her. The nuns at St. Catherine's had taught me to love my neighbor as myself, but I hated Alec on sight. He was as arrogant as Marissa was humble, as judgmental as she was forgiving. With his surfer good looks and biting wit, he lit up any room he walked into. Worst of all, he was a better artist than me, and I knew it. Alec's presence was the only thing that tainted those early days with Marissa. She brought me along to all the events I'd never been invited to, from house parties to autumn camping trips in the cliffy wilderness near campus. I wished that I could tell her what I really thought of her constant companion, but I was afraid that if I did, she would cut ties with me forever. Then, one rainy afternoon during May of our senior year, Marissa asked me to come over to her dorm room. I'd visited the lava lamp-lit, poster-covered place before, but it had never before been just the two of us. Filled with a sense of foreboding I couldn't explain, I grabbed an umbrella and hurried across campus. Marissa didn't say anything. She just hugged me and started to cry. Those were the most violent, heaving sobs I'd ever heard a person make. I have no idea how long we stood there. Marissa's head resting on my shoulder, sheets of gray rain hammering against the window, the same pirated pop-punk album playing on repeat on her PC. She didn't tell me what it was all about, but I was sure that Alec was at the bottom of it. The two of them no longer spoke to each other, and when they passed each other in the hallway, the way Marissa reacted to him made me feel ill. She scurried out of the way and hid behind anything she could. He had hurt her. I was sure of it. In the aftermath of whatever had happened, the quality of her work dropped so steeply that I began to fear she might not graduate at all. Alec, meanwhile, seemed headed straight for success. He had dialed his charm up to 11, visiting professors' offices, attending gallery openings, and schmoozing with the administration until they agreed to feature his final project in the lobby of the university museum. No one had yet seen the finished piece, but, according to the rumors, Alec already had several lucrative offers for it. The fact that Marissa was my one and only friend made the injustice of the whole thing sting even more. At St. Catherine's, I had been brought up to believe that the righteous triumphed and the wicked were punished. But outside its walls, the opposite seemed to be true. I couldn't let this stand. And that was why, on the morning before our year-end critique, I did something that would have been inconceivable to me only a few years before. Something that Mother Superior never would have approved of. From the very beginning, I had a reputation as an honest and hard-working student. I was even trusted with the keys to the studio closet, where our works in progress were kept. It was easy for me to loudly say my goodbyes to the lingering students in the hallway, go back to my dorm until my roommate fell asleep, and then return in the early hours of the morning. When I pulled the cover off Alec's sculpture, it took my breath away. It was Lucifer. Of course it was. With one hand resting poetically on his chin as though debating with himself whether he'd made the right choice by rebelling against God. The thoroughly contemporary style was unlike anything I would have done. But even so, I could see the beauty in it. From the furrow in the fallen angel's brow, down to the veins in its flexed forearm, It was truly a work of art, and that made what I had come there to do even harder. I didn't destroy Alex's masterpiece. I did something even worse. I spoiled it. I blunted the beauty of that thoughtful face, tweaked the proportions until they looked jilted and amateurish. In just a couple of hours, I had stripped the wonder out of his work. Only once did I fear that I would be found out. According to the clock on the wall, it was around 1 a.m. I had gotten so used to the absolute deep-sea loneliness of the studio late at night that I paid no attention to the racket I was making. I was wiping away sweat with the back of my sleeve when I heard the footsteps. They came with a slow, clacking echo that, for some reason, made me think of hooves. Of course, that was nonsense. They were probably just fancy dress shoes. The sort worn by a man of wealth and good taste, who can afford to take his time, because others are doing his work for him. A security guard? Impossible. They made rounds outside, but never came down here, into the basement of the art building. Even if I stopped work right away and threw the protective covering back over Alex's sculpture, what I was doing would be obvious to anyone who stepped through the door. I froze like a deer in the headlights, holding my breath. Then, whoever was out there began to laugh. It was a low, smooth chuckle, so soft that I was barely sure that I was hearing it. I listened for a long while, but there were no more sounds from the hallway. Even though I knew it was fatally stupid, even though I knew I might be caught in the act, the chisel like a murder weapon in my hand, I still left the closet to peer out the studio door. The corridor was empty. The stranger was gone, leaving behind nothing but a nasty odor that reminded me of sour smoke. In the years to come, I often wondered whether he had ever really been there at all. The next morning, I arrived at our year-end presentation with bloodshot eyes. The hushed conversations that filled the classroom reminded me of the chapel in St. Catherine's, right before Father David rapped his knuckles on the pulpit and demanded silence. We were all eager to see each other's capstone projects, the pieces we'd spent all year perfecting. In some cases, even longer. Of course, the one that everyone was most excited to see was Alex, and he had volunteered to go first. I waited with bated breath as Alec entered the storage closet to roll out his piece. Instead of the scrape of wheels, however, there was only silence. At last, Alex stumbled back into the studio, his eyes downcast. A mix of shame, horror, and disbelief played across his face. He was dropping out of the program, he announced to our professor and everyone present, effective immediately. Another wave of whispers swept through the room. I turned toward Marissa to gauge her reaction, only to discover that she was staring directly at me. Instead of looking smugly pleased, however, my best friend's eyes were wide with confusion and hurt. Marissa never explicitly said that she believed I was behind Alex's withdrawal, but things were never the same between us after that. At our graduation ceremony, we promised to keep in touch, but by then the words felt hollow. She was destined for an internship on the West Coast, and my own star was just beginning to rise. Without Alec to compete against, my own sculpture was the star of the critique. Just as his own piece would have been, my work was featured in the campus art museum and soon sold for a tidy sum. Commission requests appeared in the inbox of my university email. To my own disbelief, I was, somehow, on the map as an artist. I had achieved success beyond my wildest dreams. I only wished that it wasn't built upon the worst thing I had ever done. November 10th, 2016. 8 years into my career, I no longer received as many commissions, but My high asking price more than made up for the difference. I was putting the finishing touches on a brass cast deer I'd forged for a nature conservancy when the door buzzer of my little studio rang. Call it superstition, but in spite of my successes, I kept the place just as I'd found it when I was fresh out of college. Concrete floors, rough plywood workstations, a plastic deep sink that was so splattered with paint that its original color was impossible to guess. I didn't see the point of installing a security camera outside. I received so few visitors after all, and what was the harm in just buzzing them through? The rusty metal door squeaked open. 3 black ghosts swept into my studio. Or at least, that's what they looked like out of the corner of my eye. I barely recognized the shriveled, silver-haired figure in the center of the trio as St. Catherine's Mother Superior. The 2 hard-faced young nuns holding her upright were strangers to me. I wiped my hands on my apron and tried to smile. I had no way of knowing that they had brought the most important commission of my career, both personally and professionally. Mother Superior informed me that St. Catherine's was being moved to a larger, more modern facility. The orphanage where I'd grown up was slated to be demolished and replaced by a new cathedral. And what would be more fitting than a former alumni sculpting the central Madonna? I accepted without a second thought. It was an enormous undertaking, and the pay was less than what I was used to. But at this stage in my career, I felt I could take the hit. One of the junior nuns, Sister Ruth, informed me that the diocese legal team would come by soon with the paperwork. Before she left, Mother Superior reached out with a bony hand and pinched my cheek. "Little Maddie," she whispered, "I knew we could count on you." The lawyers arrived. The paperwork was signed. A few days later, the most expensive and most beautiful block of marble I had ever seen was delivered to my studio. I was working on some preliminary sketches when the door buzzer sounded yet again. Sure that it was the new set of tools I'd ordered, I buzzed open the door. Marissa was about the last person I'd expected to see on the other side. We hadn't seen each other in nearly a decade, but there was no mistaking those soft, blue-green eyes. I couldn't imagine how she'd found me, much less what she might want after all these years. She asked me if she could come in. I mumbled an affirmative and retreated to the deep sink to make some tea. It gave me something to do with my hands, and some time to think. By the time I got back to my workbench with 2 steaming cups of tea, I felt calm enough to face whatever Marissa had to tell me. The years hadn't been kind to her. Her frizzy red hair seemed wilted somehow, and the lines of worry in the corners of her eyes and lips were so deep they seemed to have been carved into her skin with a knife. The tattoo on her neck had faded, and there was no sign of the piercings I remembered. Marissa explained that she hadn't set foot inside a studio in years. Shortly after her move to California, she'd met someone at a concert. They were married with 2 kids. She apologized for not staying in contact, then added that she'd followed my career with interest. It was nice, she said, to see great talent being recognized. We stared into our empty teacups, apparently out of things to say to each other. Then Marissa cleared her throat. "Alex dead. Single car crash. Alcohol was involved. They're calling it an accident, but..." Marissa waved her hand like she was clearing away smoke. "I just thought you ought to know." She stood, smoothed out her long, black skirt, and shut her eyes as though the memories pained her. "That poor man," she sighed. I couldn't believe it. "Poor man?" I fumed, practically spitting her words back at her. "How can you say that? After what he..." I tried to stop myself, but it was too late. "What do you mean?" Marissa asked, bewildered. "I mean, sure, Alec was sort of an asshole back then, but we weren't exactly mature ourselves, were we? I was head over heels in love with him. And when he came out to me, I just couldn't handle it. Marissa shook her head and gave a sad little laugh. I thought my life was over, and now here I am with a husband, a pair of toddlers, and to be honest, I haven't cared about the art world in years. Funny, isn't it? How time can change your perspective on things. The floor seemed to have dropped out beneath my feet. "Matt?" Marissa asked. "Are you alright?" I wasn't alright. Not by a long shot. Maybe, I thought dizzily. Some part of me had suspected the truth all along. Maybe it was never justice that had motivated me, but rather jealousy. I told Marissa that I appreciated her visit, but I needed to get back to work. With one last, concerned look over her shoulder, she shuffled out the door. That night, I dreamed that I was working on my commission for St. Catherine's. I was creating something, but it was so twisted and misshapen that I had no idea what it was supposed to be. Something seemed different about my hands. With horror, I realized that they weren't really mine. Those strong fingers, slick with gray-green clay, suddenly stopped sculpting. They flexed, cracked, and closed around my throat. I woke up screaming. The next morning, for the first time in my life, I had to drag myself into work. The studio felt different, hostile even. I had never really paid attention to how the lights always seemed to flicker before turning on, or the odd shadows that the cobwebs cast into the corners of the room. I tried telling myself that the place hadn't changed. Only I had. But in the solitude and quiet, it wasn't so easy to believe. The block of marble in front of me began to feel more like an insurmountable obstacle than a golden opportunity. I longed to reject or at least postpone the commission, but it was too late. The contract had been signed, and neither my career nor my pride could survive a failure now. I gritted my teeth and got to work. I wanted my version of Mary to convey the same lightness, order, and gentle welcome that I felt upon my arrival at St. Catherine's all those years ago. Here, you are safe, her statue would seem to say. Here, you are valued. Here, you are loved. I could see it so clearly when I closed my eyes. And yet suddenly, my hands felt too clumsy to create it. Bit by bit, I chipped away at the stone. I found myself obsessing over the dream I'd had, over how my own fingers had betrayed me. When I looked down, I was holding a hammer that I couldn't recall picking up. It was poised over my right knuckle, as though ready to shatter it. I went to the deep sink and splashed water on my face. I needed to smell its familiar scent of clay dust and old paint, to remind myself that the things I was fearing only happened in lame horror stories. Vengeful spirits weren't real. People's bodies didn't just turn on them. Right? Shivering, I collected my tools and returned to my slowly emerging sculpture. I focused on the blunt work. Given my mental state, I couldn't trust myself with anything too delicate. All it would take was one slip of the chisel, one sudden hallucination of Alec's raw, crash-shattered face grinning down at me, and my masterpiece would be ruined. Just like I had ruined his. Time moved in odd ways that winter. One moment I would be reviewing my sketches, paralyzed by doubt. The next, I would find myself on my knees, shaping the contours of a flowing marble robe. I wasn't sure how to account for the hours that had passed in between. Sometimes I would find myself at my workbench with no idea how I'd gotten there, standing with my ankles crossed and one hand on my hip. It was a pose I hardly ever struck, but Alec often had. If I closed my eyes, I could see him just as he had been, leaning against a high table, surrounded by a crowd of eager admirers. He might be expounding on some advanced concept in art theory, or maybe just viciously insulting one of our own classmates. It didn't matter. He'd always had listeners. At that point, my own mind always seemed to betray me. My imaginary Alec would stop his discourse and look up, as though across time and distance, he knew that I was thinking of him. Despite the strangeness, I was making progress. Mother Superior herself was too frail to come by the studio, but the representatives of the diocese who stopped in seemed pleased with my work. How could I explain to them the growing, awful certainty that it wasn't really mine? The soft smile I'd intended to create seemed more like a cruel sneer. The billowing robes that were meant to represent a loving embrace reminded me instead of the outstretched wings of a vulture. Rather than advancing toward the viewer with a gentle step, my Madonna looked ready to pounce, and no one could see it but me. The dreams worsened. In one, I was frozen statue still on a pedestal, unable to even cry out as unseen figures resculpted my flesh with rasps and scrapers. In another, I was driving at high speed along a rainy, winding coastal road. I tried to turn the wheel before I crashed through a guardrail, but couldn't. My hands had frozen into marble. I began spending more and more time in the studio, partly because I wanted to get this hellish project over with as quickly as possible, partly because I was afraid to sleep, and partly because I was afraid to turn my back on my own creation. The rational part of my brain knew there was no way a 4-ton stone statue could move on its own, but its reminders were faint compared to my fear. The changes never happened while I was looking directly at my creation, but out of the corner of my eye, I often saw it making hideous faces or pointing a finger at me accusingly. How long had it been since I'd left the studio? Since I'd seen another person? I couldn't say. Nightmares and paranoid hallucinations blended together until I could no longer say for sure whether I was asleep or awake. Then, one day in late February, I nodded off at my workbench. A delicate hand caressed the nape of my neck. I wondered drowsily if it was Marissa, back to see how I was doing. But if so, who had buzzed her in? "You sleep deeply," a feminine voice whispered. "For a murderer." The fingers moving across my skin were as cold and hard as marble. I sat up with a start. I was alone in my workshop, apart from the statue smiling down at me. I was too shaken up to work, but it didn't matter. Each time I turned my back, it became a little more polished, a little more lifelike. I was sure that if I dared to touch it, I would feel a heartbeat beneath the stone. Then, in late spring, the diocese informed me that the Mother Superior had suffered a minor stroke. In the burst of energy that followed it, she insisted on seeing my progress firsthand. The atmosphere in the studio couldn't have been more different from her first visit. Instead of excitement, I was possessed by a sort of all-pervading dread. A thick sheen of sweat covered my skin, which had gone pale from lack of sunlight, and greasy from so many skipped showers. My hair was a wild mane that was already showing streaks of gray. If Mother Superior noticed the changes in my appearance, however, she was too polite to comment on them. She greeted me with the usual kiss on each cheek, then turned to my creation with her arms spread wide. "It's beautiful," she exclaimed, approaching to get a closer look at the finer touches. I leaned against my workbench, clenching my fists until my knuckles went white. Something terrible was about to happen. I knew it. Suddenly, Mother Superior took a step back. A sound rose from her throat, half shriek, half groan. She pointed a bony finger at the statue. Her eyes were marble, wide and terrified. But whatever she wanted to say never escaped her wizened lips. Sister Ruth caught her just before she collapsed unconscious to my workshop floor. As the paramedics arrived, Sister Ruth assured me that this wasn't my fault. The old woman had simply been overwhelmed with emotion. I knew better. Mother Superior had somehow seen what was at the heart of my creation, and I was responsible for it. Whatever this thing was, I couldn't let it out into the world. Even if it meant the end of my career, I had to destroy it. The next morning, diocese workers were due to move and install my masterpiece. If I was going to act, I had to do it now. As soon as the nuns and paramedics were gone, I grabbed my tools from the workbench. I would begin with its face, I decided. I couldn't stand to look at that smirk for a moment longer. I lifted the hammer and felt an implacable grip close around my wrist. I stared down, disbelieving at the stone hand that held me in place. It squeezed until the bone snapped. My hammer dropped harmlessly to the floor, and I would have sworn the statue's smile widened. It didn't release me until the work crew arrived the following morning, along with the diocese representatives. They found me leaning against the wall beside the door buzzer, clutching my shattered wrist, and raving about living statues that came to life. At the time, I didn't understand the looks of confusion and pity spread across every face. The diocese lawyer took me by the arm and explained gently that it was normal to feel nervous before such a big unveiling, but I shouldn't be worried. Everyone agreed that my work was a masterpiece. And besides, he added, it was no longer up to me. Whether I liked it or not, my creation was property of the diocese now. Hadn't I read the contract? I shook him off and ran for the statue, my chisel held high. It took 4 workers and ultimately a pair of police officers to restrain me. My desperate pleas were ignored. While I sat in police custody with my arm in a sling, my creation was installed as the centerpiece of St. Catherine's Cathedral, just above the altar. By late afternoon, everything was in place for the dedication ceremony. I used every lie I could think of to convince the police that I was no longer a danger to myself or to others. And in the end, they relented. I wound up running the 12 blocks that separated the station from a place I knew very well, the old grounds of St. Catherine's Orphanage. I smelled the frying funnel cake and heard the scratchy PA system long before I saw the cathedral itself. Every volunteer organization and small-time vendor in town seemed to be there, packed into the little courtyard where we'd once played soccer. As I approached, the bishop prepared to cut the red ribbon in the cathedral's grand archway. A comically oversized pair of scissors snapped shut, cameras flashed, and a mass of people surged forward, cheering. I glimpsed a mop of red hair at the top of the steps. Marissa. In spite of everything, she traveled all this way to support me. There was no way she could have heard the warning that I shouted, and yet she turned, squinting at the human tide behind her. For a second, our eyes met, and then the crowd swept her inside. I can't provide a first-hand account of what happened that bright May afternoon. By the time I pushed my way up the stairs, people had already begun to flee. Most of the eyewitness accounts agree about certain details, however, such as how the power went out, or how the chain of the priest's censer snapped, scattering smoke and ash in all directions. Some claim to have seen something swoop down upon the congregation from on high, and then the screaming started. The ensuing stampede caused multiple injuries, but only one death. Marissa's. According to the authorities, she had been trampled beneath the feet of the panicked crowd. I wanted to believe them. Then I saw the autopsy report. Eyes crushed to a pulp, tongue ripped out or maybe bitten off in pain, skull cracked as though by some horrible vice. They were the sort of injuries, I thought, that could just as easily have been caused by a pair of impossibly strong stone hands. The cathedral's public image never recovered. Although the diocese attempted to restore its reputation, new incidents kept tainting it. 1 month after the disastrous opening ceremonies, a janitor was found hanged by his belt from the rafters. The month after that, 2 teens disappeared while sneaking into the nave after hours. A third boy, who had gotten spooked and turned back at the last minute, said that he and his friends had chosen the cathedral for their dare because the place was cursed. Few would have admitted it out loud, but almost everyone in town shared that frightened 14-year-old's belief. Only the most faithful churchgoers dared to attend services at St. Catherine's, and in time, even they abandoned it for smaller, cozier houses of worship. An elderly parishioner told me once that, while he was inside the cathedral, he felt like he was being watched. And not by any holy virgin either, he added. By fall, the bishop was giving sermons to nearly empty pews. By winter, church authorities had given up. With as little fanfare as possible, they began taking steps to close down St. Catherine's. Less than a year after its grand opening, the cathedral's thick double doors were locked. And so they have remained ever since. That doesn't mean, however, that nothing gets in or out. Everyone who lives near St. Catherine's knows the importance of avoiding its grounds after dark. Yet, there are still disappearances. Drifters from out of town, looking for a warm place to sleep maybe, or children who lose track of time and end up walking alone beside those tall stone walls. A few months after the cathedral was closed, I even went there myself, determined to finish what I'd started in my workshop. It had been raining. Apart from the reflection of the streetlights in the water, the streets were empty. Not even alley cats risked coming this close to St. Catherine's at night. I pulled a black ski mask down over my face and jostled the tools in my backpack, comforted by their heft and weight. With its solid oak doors and barred windows, the cathedral was sealed up as tightly as a fortress. I took a deep breath and vaulted over the wall. The grounds were still maintained by the diocese, and as I tiptoed through the wet grass, I could almost imagine I was a child again, playing hide-and-seek behind the rose bushes of the orphanage that had stood here before. My guess had been correct. While the front doors of the cathedral could have withstood a battering ram, there was nothing special about the ones on the annex. With a crowbar and a few taps of my hammer, it would be easy to gain access. As I stooped to unzip my backpack, a rush of wind passed by overhead. No shadow darkened the light-polluted sky, but I sensed a presence behind me, one that felt horribly familiar. It could have crushed my head or gouged out my eyes like it did to Marissa. It could have dragged me to the crypt beneath the nave and left me there to rot, perhaps alongside the bones of those 2 missing teenagers. It could have killed me in 100 gruesome ways. But it didn't. It just placed a marble hand on my shoulder, as though giving me a gentle reminder of all those possibilities. In the time it took to blink, it was gone. I was alone on the grounds of St. Catherine's. And since that night, I've never been back. I never picked up a chisel or even a drafting pencil ever again. The thought that another creation of mine might develop a hateful will of its own makes me physically ill. But as I soon discovered, I'm not cut out for anything else. That's how I wound up here in this dive bar, waiting on the table beside you. That's how I came to overhear your conversation. Mother Superior believed in divine intervention, and maybe this is yours. If you see a lockdown church with no name on the notice board, pass it by while you still can. Hey everybody, hope you enjoyed today's story. This one was written by the very talented John Beardify. John was kind enough to write this story specifically for Jordan Grupe Horror, so I really appreciate him doing that. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. Please give some support to the author. I'll link down in the description below links to his books, and hope you guys will give him some support on Amazon in the comments. I really like this story. I'm a bit of an artist myself. Not so much sculpture, but more so drawing and painting. Went to school for 3D animation back in the day. So I thought this one was really good. From an artist's perspective, kind of some familiar ideas of imposter syndrome and, thinking everybody else's art is better than yours and, you're never going to live up to that standard. So yeah, I thought this one touched on some really interesting themes and was a very good story overall. I should have more exclusive stories, commissions written just for Jordan Grupe Horror coming up on the channel soon. I'm trying to reach out to more authors to hopefully get some more exclusive content for the channel. I know some people get a little miffed when they've heard a particular story on a different channel before, so I do try to avoid that, but it's not always entirely possible. We're not really coordinating with other narrators to see who's reading what, and so I do apologize for some people who have heard different stories before and they come over here expecting a new story and see something that they've potentially heard before. Hopefully that doesn't happen very often, and like I said, with this one being exclusive, can guarantee nobody's heard this one before. Hopefully you guys all enjoyed it. I'll also be writing more stories myself for the channel, more Hollow's End coming soon. I'm currently working on wrapping up the circus season. For anyone who's interested in Hollow's End, there is the Hollow's End book is out now. Welcome to Hollow's End. You can check that out on Amazon, and I'll be doing an audiobook version for that as well. I know a lot of people have been asking in the comments about an audiobook version for that, so should have announcements about that coming soon. A couple other quick things. Want to ask if you can, please follow us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, whatever your preferred podcast app is. Still trying to continue growing on Spotify and still posting there old stories 3 days a week on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. And then we're also posting the new stuff that's coming out on YouTube to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Patreon as well now. So wherever you follow the channel, you should be able to see the newest videos coming out every day. I want to give a quick shout out to another narrator, Dark Knight Tales. If you guys haven't checked out his channel, super talented author as well as narrator. He's got a great voice, and he writes his own stories as well. Just want to give him a little bit of love here. Back when we did that Twitter post a while back, trying to get all of our channels remonetized during the big demonetization wave, for some reason, Dark Knight Tales got skipped over in that. So I'm hoping he'll be remonetized soon when he reapplies. But in the meantime, I just wanted to ask if you guys can please give him a follow over on Spotify. Dark Knight Tales, super talented author and narrator. And yeah, just unfortunately getting a little bit of unfair treatment right now. So I'm trying to look out for him, and hopefully you guys will give him some love on Spotify, and hopefully he'll be remonetized on YouTube as well soon. All right, that's about it for me today. I'll be back on Friday with another story, and we're going to have new videos coming out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on YouTube. All right, hope you have a good night.